Welcome to CNBC International's Facebook Live. I'm Akiko Fujita, coming to you from the FinTech Festival here in Singapore with a very special edition of Life Hacks Live. We are joined today by the CEO of Ripple, Brad Garlinghouse, which Ripple, as you know, of course, the company behind the enterprise blockchain technology. They're also behind the world's third largest cryptocurrency, XRP. Welcome to you.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So this is a different kind of interview, I'm sure. Not sure if you've seen any one of our episodes before, but the rules are pretty much simple. We've got a wheel. We're going to spin it. We've got some categories here: routine, career, leadership, balance, lessons, and obstacles. We'll see where it lands, and then we'll get going.
Fabulous.
All right, so you want to take the first spin?
All right, we'll do it. That was quick. I didn't spin it hard enough.
It doesn't spin very well, does it? Okay, let's start with career. The question is, I think you get this question a lot. When you were at Yahoo, you wrote the famous Peanut Butter Manifesto in 2006, saying the company was spreading its resources too thin. Did you expect it to become such a big deal, and what did you learn from it? It's interesting, right? Because that was in 2006, and there were conversations as recently as a year ago about, perhaps this is prophetic, and some of the issues Yahoo is struggling with that still exist.
I think it's true, unfortunately. So to answer the question, I did not expect it to kind of take on a life of its own. And kind of what's interesting is this is before the world of Twitter, and even Facebook was in its earliest days. So it became a meme before social memes really were starting. And I think it's because many companies suffer from clear focus and understanding who your customer is and what problem you're trying to solve, and you quickly get a little bit, hey, there's lots of things we can do. I think great companies have a clear understanding of who their customer is and where they're going deep. Yahoo in particular struggled, I think, in part, what does the Yahoo brand represent? If you think about what PayPal represents, I say the word PayPal, you think, oh, it's a payments thing. And even really Google, particularly then, it was search. Yahoo has always been, well, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Some people thought then that was good. I always argued, look, unless we have clarity about who we are and what customer we're serving, we're going to struggle.
So what's the lesson you learned from being there? Is it about just making sure that there's a lot of clarity around the mission for the company and a lot of focus?
I think it really does come back to just managers sometimes making tough decisions about, here's the most important customer, here's the most important segment. It turned out in the space that Yahoo was in and Google was in, search was the most important business. And Yahoo didn't invest as much as it could have around search. I think there's other things we could have decided to own, but again, we were kind of spreading ourselves thin across a lot of things, and increasingly different people were attacking us at different vectors, and that made it difficult to compete.
Okay, let's keep the wheel going. I'm going to try to take the spin this time.
Absolutely.
Okay, obstacles.
All right.
The question is, cryptocurrencies have come under attack by a lot of big names in business and government. How do you deal with that criticism? We're, of course, talking about names like Jamie Dimon.
Yeah.
We had DBS this morning saying that it was a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
You've heard the criticism. What's your response?
Well, look, I think it's exciting in some ways. You had a level of attention around it. And I think I was fortunate to move out to San Francisco 20 years ago, the earliest days of the internet. And for me, the earliest days of the internet, it really was, you could feel it was a movement. And some people then argued that Amazon was never going to make any money, and a lot of smart money was shorting Amazon. Here we are 20 years later, and Amazon's making a lot of money, and one of the most valuable companies on the planet. I think that anytime you have a new shift, and I think for many, cryptocurrency and digital assets, and really even blockchain is a shift in how we think about how transactions are managed, how value is stored and moved. And so I think you're seeing that fight almost inside of companies, inside of individuals who follow this space. I think if you solve a real problem, and I think Bitcoin is solving a problem around the store of value, XRP is solving a problem around payments. If you solve a real problem, ultimately these will be defined by the utility of the underlying asset. I think we're in the earliest innings. I think that this is going to be a very large asset class, and we're just in the earliest days.
How much of it you think is just about communication? Because right now we talk about cryptocurrencies just all lumped in as one. You've made it very clear you think it's important to have it centralized. You think that this is a store of value. This is not how we're going to be paying for things in the future. How much of the messaging is important? I
think the messaging is really important. And one of the things that has happened is you have things that happen within the crypto world that actually create dark clouds that follow it. Frankly, the earliest days of Silk Road, which that was a use case for Bitcoin, paying for drugs. And yes, governments step in and they shut down Silk Road, a new one pops up. In today's world, I think ICOs are an example of a dark cloud. ICOs, these initial coin offerings where people are issuing tokens, they're really more like securities than actually have a token that has utility the way XRP solves a problem. It has utility in solving a payments problem. I think those dark clouds are actually bad for the ecosystem. They're bad for the movement, if you will. And I think it's important to kind of continue to focus, work with regulators, work with governments, and for us, working with banks is an indicator of that. If we don't work with regulators, banks certainly aren't going to work with us.
Okay, great. Let's take another spin. It's your turn now. Okay, which one is that? Lessons. Okay. What kind of portfolio should young investors build, keeping in mind the high volatility risks that come with cryptocurrencies? I think this is a question, largely about this space. I mean, there's so many cryptocurrencies as you just pointed out. So what do you think people who are trying to get in on this space should keep in mind?
Well, I think some of those interesting things happening for investors to access this market are the kind of almost index funds. There's a number of people offering the ability to buy into an index of crypto. So one of the things that's nice about that, it gives you diversification, which is good. It also actually reduces the volatility. Instead of owning one that might have a lot of volatility, when you're owning multiple, some of them aren't as volatile as others. Now, that being said, I would be cautious about what the index is covering. Is it the top 3? Is it the top 5? Is it the top 10? I think somewhere around 5, you get into kind of 10 to 20, and there's some things in there that I think would make me a little bit nervous because it's not clear the utility, and sometimes the utility is intentionally designed to circumvent governments, circumvent regulators. I don't think those are very sustainable over the long haul because I don't think governments are going to go away anytime soon. How
important is it to look at, if you're talking about tokens, the backers too, to understand, what's really behind that and what kind of value it has?
I think that, what's the best thing to ask is what problems it solves, what utility does it have? And if the utility is large and growing, there'll be more and more demand for that token to solve that problem. There are some ICOs I will highlight in a positive way that actually there's a real underlying token that I think does solve something. And I'll use Filecoin as an example. Filecoin's trying to build a new version of AWS, a new version of Dropbox, where the resources are allocated by using a Filecoin. I don't follow that company particularly closely, but I understand the use case. And if they're successful in driving usage and changing the way storage is allocated broadly, maybe Filecoin will work.
Okay, great. Let's see if we can spin this.
Another career question.
Which one do you think that is?
We did career before. Let's do leadership.
Let's do leadership. Yeah. All right. Okay. This is, I think, pretty similar to what we were talking about. Blockchain can go over a lot of people's heads. What tips do you have for explaining something complicated to a wider audience?
Yeah. One of the things I always ask when we're talking about blockchain is I think sometimes the hype gets ahead of the reality. One of the questions I'll ask is, why is the use case better than a database? A database is a pretty good tool, and some people use blockchain as like, well, I'm going to use blockchain to track flower freshness. I think, well, you can use a database for that. It's not quite clear to me why that's important for using a blockchain. But I think the more you can draw real-world examples and make it tangible to people, for Ripple, solving a cross-border problem using blockchain technologies, one of the things I often talk about is if I wanted to move money from Singapore to Los Angeles today, the fastest way for me to do that is to go buy an airplane ticket at the Singapore airport and fly it there. That's something that people can understand and get their head around. That today, if you're doing that through the banking system, through SWIFT, it would take somewhere around 3 days.
Yeah.
Why is it we live in a world where I can stream video from the space station, but I can't move my own money from point A to point B?
What are some other use cases do you think we haven't talked about yet? I mean, the money transfer is a very easy one to understand because a lot of us have been through there before, but...
I think there's some other interesting blockchain use cases. I mean, one I'll highlight, I don't know of any particular leaders in it, but using a blockchain to track something like titles of ownership of homes. In the United States, this is a big business, title insurance, and if you could actually use a blockchain to track and manage the transfer of titles, you could actually really change the way that industry works. I think a blockchain is a very appropriate technology for that use case. But anytime you're talking about marketplaces and using digital assets to allocate resources within marketplaces, anytime you do that, Ripple thinks about it as, okay, you have to have interoperability between these different pieces. And we very much think about how to sell connectors first to banks, but ultimately to other marketplaces such that the underlying tokens can be exchangeable in a real-time, efficient way.
Okay, great. I'll let you take the next spin.
All right. Oh, another split.
Let's do it.
All right.
Let's do it one more time. Oh, there
Balance.
you go.
We haven't done that one.
Okay, this is a question you might get a lot. Do you personally invest in other cryptocurrencies? And do you follow your own advice? You just talked about some of the precautions people should take.
Yeah, well, I definitely, I follow my own advice 100%. I'm personally invested in a couple of other crypto funds that give me exposure to other assets. On a personal basis, I'm long BTC Bitcoin. I guess technically I'm also long Bitcoin Cash, but I'm also long XRP. I personally think the Ethereum market is in a world where a lot of ICOs are being built upon and managed within the Ethereum framework. I think if ICOs come under a lot of regulatory pressure, which I think they will, it's not clear to me what that's going to mean for the Ethereum market. So I have not been long Ethereum.
What do you think about the crackdown that we've been seeing, especially here in Asia, China, Korea, around ICOs? Is that a healthy thing? Is there a necessary pause here?
I think it's extremely healthy. I think that some of what has been happening, I think, is a little bit fraud-like, as opposed to no, there's a real problem we're solving. And most of them, and even the head of the SEC said recently in the United States that most ICOs look more like securities than they do useful utility tokens. Now that isn't always true, but I think there's a lot of stuff. I see Paris Hilton promoting an ICO. I don't view that as a good sign for
Floyd
that market.
Mayweather.
Yeah, I saw that one too.
Got it. Okay, great. We've got some questions coming in. Here's one question. Will Ripple be utilized by major retail corporations like Amazon and Walmart?
Well, certainly we think about using XRP to solve a institutional payments problem, and that absolutely applies to corporates. You think about a business like Walmart, that in order for them to fund their supply chain on a global basis, they're pre-funding accounts around the world, and they have a lot of capital. Their treasury management, they have probably hundreds of people in treasury management managing billions of dollars afloat around the world. That can be managed much more efficiently. Now, if the question is, will you use XRP to buy things on Amazon or Walmart, I think that day is further away. I think that we aren't trying to replace fiat currency. I think there's a massive opportunity to solve a cross-border payments problem using digital assets, reducing the time it takes, reducing the cost. Ultimately, is there an opportunity at some point in the future to use digital assets to buy retail? Maybe, but I don't think that's going to happen in the next 10 years.
That's interesting. I was just over in Japan, where we're seeing a lot of retailers accepting Bitcoin now. A lot of companies also starting to offer what's essentially a debit card that allows you to use the value that's stored in that cryptocurrency. Yeah. Do you see that as the first step, or you think ultimately it's really just about storing value like gold?
I think it's a little bit of a novelty. I've been on panels at various Bitcoin and crypto conferences and talking about XRP and what we're doing on an institutional basis. And I'll ask the question, how many people in this room have used Bitcoin to buy something? And, you'll get 5% of the hands will go up and say, most of them own Bitcoin. Maybe only 5% have used Bitcoin to buy something. And then I'll say, okay, how many have used Bitcoin to buy something more than once? And it'll go down like 1%. Because people use it, but ultimately, in the US, the dollar works pretty well. My Visa card works pretty well. Yeah. There are markets where it makes sense. There are markets where you have currencies that are, less healthy. There's a volatility problem. There's other problems. Argentina, you're seeing some markets where there's a lot of demand for using the retail use case, but I think that's not in a euro denominated or yen denominated or Singapore dollar denominated currencies.
Okay, we've got another question coming in from Facebook, and this question is, how does Ripple plan to make a visit to countries like India? You're already in India.
We are in India. We have an office in Mumbai, a handful of customers there already. I think we publicly talked about the work we're doing with Yes Bank as well as Access Bank. Certainly there's more opportunity there. We're very excited about kind of how things are going in India for us right now, and continues to be a priority.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot more upside, I imagine, in emerging markets, right?
Yeah. Well, also India is a unique case because they obviously have gone through their own domestic, really, I call it a revolution from within the system, if you will, in terms of digitizing
with demonetization.
Payments.
Yeah.
Right. It's fascinating, and I think it really creates an opportunity to kind of leapfrog other countries and other parts of the world by skipping a step. Not dissimilar to really how the telecommunications industry evolved. Some markets in Africa in particular skipped wireline, went directly to mobile. Now you're going to see some markets say, hey, look, we can go directly from this to a blockchain-based solution and not worry about the short-term step.
Yeah, really going over what it took, how many years in the U.S., right? All
Right.
right, let's get back to the wheel.
All right.
We'll spin it. Okay,
Another career.
We've been getting a lot of career questions. What made you decide to enter this space? We're talking about blockchain and cryptocurrency because we were talking about your time over at Yahoo before. You were also at Hightail.
Yeah.
What made you get into the space?
It really, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in Silicon Valley. As I was looking around, to me, what was happening in the blockchain and crypto world was a movement, and I felt like, going to work, let's say another food delivery company. I think San Francisco has somewhere between 6 and 10 food delivery companies. I'm picking on that as an example, but what's happening in crypto and certainly what's happening at Ripple, we have an opportunity to fundamentally change the way global commerce is managed from a payments point of view. If we're successful, that's transformative. It allows us to put our own little dent in the universe. So far, we've been extremely fortunate. We have over 100 customers, and I think given the network effects associated with that, we feel like we've really hit a tipping point where the value of participating keeps growing by the number of nodes on the network. It's an exponential increase in value. So for me, joining this industry was a belief that there is something, a movement, a fundamental change happening. And I thought Ripple was really focused on the right aspect of solving an enterprise use case as opposed to maybe going after those consumer use cases that I think are still pretty early.
Do you have a mental checklist or, kind of how you go about assessing new opportunities? Because you've been in right in the heart of the tech space in Silicon Valley for 20 years now. I imagine you have a lot of opportunities that come your way.
Yeah.
What's the checklist you go through to decide, okay, is it worth leaving this company for another job?
Well, one of the first things I always think about are the people involved. And, are a group of smart, motivated, ambitious people that you want to work with. That's an important quotient. The size of the market, I think, is very important. I think some people are solving interesting problems, but there's a very small market, which is less exciting to me. The third one I would highlight is there a defensibility? Is there differentiation, competitive differentiation that's building a competitive moat such that as other competitors enter the market, you have some ability to protect your position in the market. And I think, again, for Ripple, I think all of those things exist. Some of the people at Ripple, I think, are truly the smartest people I've ever worked with in my career, which makes it a lot of fun to go to work every day.
Okay, we've got more questions pouring in on Facebook. What would be your forecast on XRP versus dollar value by the end of 2018?
Well, so one of the things I always say when I'm asked this kind of question is I really don't think that much about the price of XRP in the short term. I make I don't think about 3 days, 3 months. I think more about it in the 3 to 5 year. If we drive a lot of utility and a lot of usefulness of XRP in terms of solving that payments flow. And again, if we go back to the question about Walmart and Amazon, if you're solving a corporate treasury problem measured in the trillions of dollars, I think there's a very large market opportunity for XRP to solve that problem. How the market behaves even over the course of 2018, I think is hard to predict. I will say that I think the institutional money is just starting to come into digital assets. And that's true for Bitcoin and Ethereum and XRP. But I think as that money comes into this, what I mean by institutional money, I mean pension funds and fiduciary managed money. I think that will create a lot of demand for digital assets. And if you have fixed supply, as you do with XRP, and you have increasing demand, you don't have to be an econ major to know what happens when you have increasing demand and fixed supply.
Is that a good thing for the space to get more and more institutional investors in?
Well,
some would argue it legitimizes it.
For sure. That's the important point, is I think it builds trust. You saw an announcement recently, the CME group is investigating whether or not to offer derivatives and futures associated with digital assets like Bitcoin and XRP. And I think that that allows more institutions to participate because now you can hedge some of the volatility that you might not have wanted that kind of exposure to. So I think it just makes it that much more appealing as an institutional asset class, and that brings in more money.
All right, let's get some more questions from Facebook. See if we can pull these up. How do you plan on making it easier for everyday people new to cryptocurrencies to securely invest in XRP and use it?
Well, I guess my short answer to that is Ripple's focused on an institutional use case, an institutional problem. We don't think as much about how do we make sure it's accessible to consumers. That being said, we do. XRP is listed at, I think, over 50 exchanges around the world. We certainly think about how do we grow that and make it accessible, and we work with some of those exchanges to make sure it's done securely. But ultimately, we're trying to solve that institutional use case, that institutional problem, more so than appealing to speculators that might have a short-term. Frankly, what you saw happen in Bitcoin Cash over the last handful of days, it was incredible in terms of the run-up. I actually don't want to see that type of dynamic within XRP. I want to see a long-term sustainable value creation by driving real-world users and usefulness of the digital asset.
Yeah, and you've had a lot of partnerships in place with big banks
so
too.
Good.
Okay, is it my turn? I think you get to spin next. Okay, lessons.
All right.
Oh, okay. You are an active angel investor. What are some lessons you have learned after investing in more than 40 companies?
So I've greatly enjoyed being an angel investor because it kind of keeps me exposed to what entrepreneurs are doing in new categories. I'll go back to those same lessons I was talking about in terms of why I went to Ripple. The number one thing is around people. Are these the right people you want to be invested in? Because lots of things will go wrong as you pursue a new entrepreneurial venture, and these are the people that can fight through those obstacles. The second is the market one that's interesting. I made a number of investments just as an angel, amateur investor in the genomics space. It's not a space I know well, but I think like blockchain, there's a lot that's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years in that space. And I think you invest in the right people that are going after that right market opportunity, there might be some big rewards there.
I've heard a lot of VCs say that it's really about investing in the person and not necessarily the idea, because the idea will always change.
For sure.
Is that the same thinking? That
Absolutely. The idea, as you go out and execute an idea, you're going to run into roadblocks. Investing in the people who understand which roadblocks they should push through and which roadblocks they need to turn and go around or change some part of their business model. Having those entrepreneurs who have that good judgment, it's really hard to find, and you see some of them that have had repeat success. I mean, those are the kind of entrepreneurs you obviously want to invest in.
Okay, we've got one question coming in from Facebook. Will there be important news involving XRP use after the escrow lockup?
So we announced the escrow lockup back in late spring, I think, and we committed to having it done by the end of the year. Will there be other important news? I mean, my view is there's always news coming out from Ripple. We announced the first institutional use case for using XRP into payment flows with a payment company called Qualix. Recently, we announced a bunch of new customers recently, and certainly between now and the end of the year, we continue to make good momentum signing up new banks. We just announced publicly, started talking about the Central Bank Summit we hosted in New York City a few weeks ago. We had a couple dozen central banks around the world come together and talk about how different central banks are thinking about blockchain and digital assets. We obviously talked about Ripple and XRP and the things we're doing, but it was also allowing those banks to come together and talk to each other and hear from each other how different banks and different central banks are thinking about regulating crypto in that category. So there's
any talk of central banks maybe thinking about issuing their own coins?
It's an interesting question. That question was definitely discussed. I think you have to come back to, okay, what problem is that solving? Even if you offer a central bank coin, you still have to have a settlement to another central bank coin. So from Ripple's point of view, you still have a cross-border problem. There might be some efficiencies of using a digital asset on a domestic basis, but it doesn't obviate the need for that cross-border efficiency that Ripple's very focused on. That interoperability between different currencies, but even in the future, as I mentioned earlier, between different marketplaces, using digital assets to allocate resources.
Okay, I think I have one more. We have time for one more.
All right.
Very quick one.
And your spin.
All right.
Another
let's do one more. We have a lot of careers.
Okay, well,
I'm going to let you take the last one.
All right, so we take the orange one.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one to end on. What keeps you up at night?
Oh.
That's a long list, right?
Well, yeah. The 17-hour flight from San Francisco to Singapore kept me up for part of last night. But, what keeps me up at night? Honestly, a lot of it comes down to at Ripple, do we have the right people doing the right things? The pressure to move quickly keeps me up at night. This is a very dynamic space. It's moving very quickly. And even on a weekend like last weekend where you saw tremendous shifts in the price of BTC and BCH, that keeps me up at night, the uncertainty that's happening there. But look, I think at a macro level, you're continuing to see governments, regulators lean in and understand that there really are real value propositions of using digital assets, of using blockchain. And so, I'm sleeping pretty well right now.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, Brad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this edition of Life